Thank you. Let me start with unpacking some of these claims of deficit reduction to date. I mean, gosh, by the sound of it, it sounds like, you know what, we're pretty much done. We don't have to worry about it anymore, you know? Problem solved. But when you measure deficit reduction in a gross, not net way, by simply saying, look at all the deficit reduction that was that occurred, you can't neglect the deficit increases that occurred at the same time. So missing from this computation of $4.3 trillion of achieved deficit reduction is the stimulus that passed during the same time, $831 billion, the payroll tax holiday, $111 billion, the other payroll tax holiday, $89 billion, the 24% increase in non-defense appropriations in the first 2 years of the president's first term, $576 billion, disaster spending above the caps, $110 billion, Sandy supplemental, $50 billion, the debt service that accompanies all that, $300 billion. If you go with net numbers, it's about $500 billion, generously, of deficit reduction, not 4.3. If you take a look at the claims in this budget, the numbers in the budget claim $1.4 trillion in deficit reduction that are being proposed. If you take out the war gimmick, which we all know is a gimmick, that's $675 billion. If you remove the extension of the stimulus credits, which are assumed in this baseline, that's $161 billion. If you remove the doc fix assumed in this baseline unpaid for, that's $249 billion. The unpaid Pell Grants, $28 billion. The debt service that accompanies this, $175 billion. If you net all of this out, if you strip out the gimmicks that have been well-worn, well-established gimmicks, it's about $119 billion of deficit reduction. And all you have to point to the fact is that this budget never balances, ever. And so I understand maybe it polls well to use the word balance every third word in every sentence when you're describing fiscal policy. But how is a budget balanced if it never balances? And I just think we need to be a little more honest about the true fiscal nature of the situation of the problems we have. That's just a statement. I want to ask you a couple technical questions because I also want to be kind to all the members here on time. The doc fix, for instance. In the past, we've been paying for the doc fix. We've done this on a bipartisan basis. Why is it that in this budget you assume the doc fix is fully funded and not paid for?
Well, we have balanced deficit reduction of $1.8 trillion incremental to what we've achieved to date. We believe that it's honest budgeting to acknowledge that we're not going to cut doctors by 30%. We fix it year over year over year, and therefore it should be in the adjusted baseline.
So
we have $1.8 trillion.
So let me get you there. Since you're saying, irrespective of the fact that we paid for this by cutting spending elsewhere in the past, you're saying we will not pay for it anymore.
Well, overall,
the
president's budget saves $400 billion in health care costs, $370 billion of Medicare, $200 billion in other mandatory, $200 billion in discretionary. The doc fix is something that happens year over year. So let's be honest in our baselines and acknowledge that it happens every year and do deficit reduction accordingly. I think you threw around a lot of numbers in that opening statement. It's hard to track even.
I'm sure you've seen them.
Yeah, they're all over the place. So I think at the end of the day, we have to look at the bottom line. The same way when I was in the private sector, I looked at the bottom line. The bottom line of the president's budget is that deficits are a declining path, debt's on a declining path. We're below 3% of GDP in 2016, and we're below 2% at 1.7%. Of GDP, our deficits are by 2023.
What is your public
debt? I worry that we end up spending a lot of time with baselines and what's in baselines, what's not in baselines. It's best to go to the bottom line.
Public debt in the beginning of the budget window and at the end of the budget window are north of 70%. That's not much accomplishment over 10 years.
Debt's on a declining path, which is...
We know that that's organic to the baseline.
Which is consistent.
We know that that's happening if we did nothing,
it's
irrespective of this budget.
Simpson. It's an important benchmark. We need to have balanced deficit reduction. We also cannot think of deficit reduction alone as an economic plan.
Why do we start the deficit reduction in 2020? Why not start now?
Deficit reduction does not start in 2020.
The deficit reduction policies proposed in this budget start in 2020.
Now, there's deficit reduction well in advance of 2020.
So let me ask you this then.
And that's how we achieve deficits on a declining path. But I want to make the point that deficit reduction is important. It's an important component of an economic plan, but in and of itself is not an economic plan. We have to put people back to work. We have to increase our global competitiveness. We have to invest in R&D. We have to invest in education. Most important way to achieve deficit reduction beyond the policies that we're talking about here today is economic growth. I think we all agree with that.
A case in point. If we didn't pass this budget, the deficit would drop faster. So when I take a look at war spending, the budget assumes we're going to be spending at these high inflated levels with the kind of troop count we have in Afghanistan right now and in perpetuity. And if you have a drawdown, then you count that as savings, $675 billion. Now, we all agree that we have a withdrawal occurring in 2014. That's stated policy. It's a bipartisan agreement. But we're going to count as a spending cut the idea that the baseline assumes we would be at full troop strength well beyond 2014. And if you're going to have a withdrawal in 2014, that all of a sudden counts as a spending cut of $675 billion. In other words, not spending money that was never going to be spent in the first place is now counted as a spending cut?
Well, let me review this. CBO has in its baseline continued spending in OCO, the Overseas Contingency Operation. We actually cap the spending, which is important because it closes the back door for further discretionary spending. Furthermore, the savings that you're talking about from OCO versus CBO's baseline, the official scorekeeper's baseline, are not counted in the $2.5 trillion that I mentioned, and they're not counted in the $1.8 trillion that I mentioned. So $4.3 trillion of deficit reduction, none of which is in the OCO.
That's not. OCO. It is in your 1.8, and I do not know how you explain that it's not.
If we want to go back to the slide, the 1.8 is $400 billion of healthcare spending cuts, $200 billion of other mandatory, $200 billion of discretionary, $230 billion from CPI, $580 billion from tax reform, and the resulting interest savings. That does not include any OCO.
You're double counting it. You're using it to offset other spending, and you're now counting it as net.
The only place we use OCO is because of the president's policies to end the war in Iraq, draw down and end in Afghanistan. We're going to take some of that money, a small portion of it, and invest in infrastructure in this country.
So
that is not part of the $1.8 trillion deficit reduction.
Therein lies the issue here, which is we're taking spending that will never be spent, and we're using it as if it's free money to spend. That's the problem with budgeting. Look, CBO doesn't have a choice. The law requires that they have a baseline that reflects current law. And so they have parameters placed upon them that allows such a gimmick to proliferate. The point I would make is, if all of this grand deficit reduction were real, then why does your budget never balance? I mean, these are the things. Why are we adding $8.2 trillion to the debt in this budget? We can go round and round. My time's running out. And I'm putting myself on a clock. I want to ask you a question about IPAB. We talked about this on the phone the other day, but on table S9, page 197 in your budget, you have IPAB beginning to accrue savings in 2021, 2023, for a total of about $4.1 billion. But you lower the growth rate to GDP 0.5, but your baseline claims that cost growth is within that parameter. So this is a sincere question. Where does the 4.1 come from? How does the IPAB mandate of GDP 0.5 in this budget get that savings if your assumed Medicare cost growth is below that?
Well, Medicare cost growth, to your point, has come in quite a bit, and we believe that the Affordable Care Act is helping to drive that. The way the IPAB works is it's not just at a total level. There are components. Put $4 billion in context. You're talking about a fraction
No, I understand
of 1%.
that, but in past budgets, you've never
at the end
claimed
of the
savings.
window. So we believe that through continued progress in reducing unnecessary care, promoting more cost-effective care through accountable care organizations and other innovations, that Medicare costs will continue to come in. IPAB serves an important backstop function, but with healthcare costs coming in the way they are, we don't anticipate that backstop being necessary.
Okay, so that's what I'm trying to get. So that's the discretionary exercise of IPAB's authority, because
No, it's set in law. It's GDP plus 0.5.
right. So it's set in law, GDP per 0.5. They have to make the spending come within that cap. You're saying that the spending never exceeds that cap, yet they're showing savings.
I'm saying
in
at
the
the end of the window it does by a very small percent.
Okay,
We would assume, as we've seen across the last couple of years, that healthcare spending will continue to come in and that backstop will not be necessary. To be clear, if it ever is, any recommendations of the IPAB comes to Congress for approval.
No, I understand the process.
And so ultimately IPAB's there to protect seniors and ensure that we don't have excessive costs.
Okay, but I just want to be clear. I'm not trying to put you in a trap. You're saying that by 2021, the cap will be hit, breached
For
by ever so small amounts,
for a component.
and IPAB's mandate triggers, and they have to start producing recommendations.
Again, yes, that is the case as currently projected. I think we've seen significant progress in containing healthcare costs across the last couple of years. We anticipate further progress, and therefore that will most likely be unnecessary.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Van Halen.